Good evening and welcome to We the People, brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis. My name is Joan Higginbotham and I'll be your host for this evening's program. Well, for the last 30 years, I have been bringing to you news about Minneapolis, things that the League of Women Voters is interested in, and this is my last show here with We the People. So I thought tonight it would be interesting to sort of see what was Minneapolis like in '89 and how has it changed in the 30 years since we got started. And I have the perfect guest tonight. Kara Latovsky is the head of Mill City Consulting, but she has done so many things. I'm going to just tell you a few of them. She's on the Public Housing Authority Board. She was on the Met Council. She was an aide to Mayor Rybeck. She has also just finished a job as the interim executive director of the Hennepin County History Center, and of course, she was on their board for a while as well. So, Kara, you come here with lots of knowledge, historical and present day.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Joan. It's quite an honor to be here on your last show.
Right, yes. Well, you're the right person at the right time.
That's great.
So now, you said you had some data that sort of compared '89 to 19.
Well, so let's talk first about 1989 and what was going on in 1989. You remember George Bush was president, George Bush the first.
First George Bush.
That's when Harry Met Sally came out.
Really?
Feels like it was last summer, but it wasn't, of course.
Still very timely.
That was the year Taylor Swift was born, and was also the year that the World Wide Web started.
Oh, really?
So imagine life before that,
yes.
Just can't even imagine it anymore. And again, another thing that feels like it was just last summer was the Berlin Wall fell in 1989.
Was it
so that was, yes, so for the past 30 years, a lot of things have changed, but that's what was going on in 1989.
It is amazing to me. Well, what do you think is the biggest change here in Minneapolis in those 30 years?
So I think the biggest change that happened in the last 30 years was really the number of people that live in Minneapolis, where they live, how they get around, and the diversity of those people.
Now, has the population of Minneapolis increased in those 30 years?
It absolutely has. So I have some numbers here. In 1990, the 1990 census, so that's the closest we can get to 1989, there were 368,383 people. And that was the lowest after the post-war decline. And after that, things started increasing. But we've seen a real big increase in the last 8 years. And so now the census estimates that there are 425,403 people. So that's 25, if we do some math, it's almost 50,000 more people living in Minneapolis
now. Is that unusual for the Midwest? I mean, they talk about the Rust Belt and everything, but we don't seem to have suffered that fate.
Yeah, I wouldn't put us in the Rust Belt. We're certainly in the Midwest, which hopefully we can talk a little bit about that in terms of our politics. But I think the recent years have been quite good for cities. There's been a lot of population boom in a lot of cities around the country.
So we're typical, but we're doing well.
We are doing well. I mean, we have some of the same problems that a lot of other cities that are growing have with affordable housing, and certainly with trying to accommodate more people and what that means for transit. I mean, I think a lot of cities are facing that challenge.
I think in '89, nobody lived on the river that I can think of.
That's right. In 1989, Fujiya was still at the river, so the river road that the park board built was not yet complete.
So that's one really big change.
Yeah. So there's a lot of other neighborhoods down there. So we have Mill City, the Mills District. Huge number of people who live down there now. North Loop, I don't think there was anybody except maybe my brother living in a warehouse that didn't have any running water in a band. He was one of those kind of guys in 1989. A lot of people living in North Loop now. The East Town, the area around the new stadium and the Guthrie, that's all new as well.
So it's really changed, but what have those changes meant for the rest of the city? We have people. Are there still people in South Minneapolis? I mean,
Yes, I think a lot of neighborhoods have experienced new housing going up. I mean, certainly along, like Uptown is a booming area. One of the things that I referenced already about what's so different today than 30 years ago was how people get around. We certainly now have the Blue Line and the Green Line.
That's right, yes.
And the ridership on those two lines is increasing month over month and breaking records constantly. But another big change is that the bike paths. And I think about the Midtown Greenway and all the housing that's gone up along the Midtown Greenway.
You know, people weren't really riding their bikes to get any place. I mean, they would ride bikes, but they would ride them around the lakes and stuff like that. They didn't ride them to get to work.
It was very like pedestrian, you know, you'd like ride for recreation.
Yeah, exactly.
And once that Greenway went in, it was like people are riding to commute.
To get places.
To get places.
So that's a real change.
And it's really been a game changer. There was a year when I was working for Mayor Ryback when Bicycling Magazine declared Minneapolis the #1 bike city.
I remember that.
And it was probably 09, 08, 09 in that area. And it was right when we were launching Nice Ride, so bike share. Mm-hmm. Bike share is another thing that's really changed the way that people get around.
Now, okay, so we talked about more people moving downtown, but right now at this very moment, there's a really housing crunch. Have we always had a housing crunch like the one we have now?
I feel like from my perspective, there's always been a deep concern about affordable housing. And it's changed its flavor a little bit. It is not a new problem. And then every once in a while there's a cycle, but right now the vacancy rates are so low, and so that really puts pressure. Even with all the new housing units that are going up, there is still that significant pressure on rents and rents increasing. One thing that's happened too is Minneapolis used to be a majority of owner-occupied units.
Oh, yes.
And it was in that between 2000 and 2010 where it's become more of a renter population. And it's still in that, 50-50. It's not like totally dramatic, but that is a shift and a trend that we're seeing.
Was that because of the Great Recession?
I think that was part of it.
Now, and of course, we still hear that people who are poor and oftentimes people who are people of color are the ones who are really suffering the most because of the housing problem. And has our population of people of color changed in those 30 years?
Yeah, dramatically. When I think about the big change, the number of people, where they live, how they get around, and then the increase in diversity. So the 1990 census says that 78.4% of the population was white, and now it's 61.8%.
Really? Wow, that's a huge change.
And so the increase in Black African American population, and they don't separate out immigrant numbers from that, it's increased 5%. Asians have increased over 1%, and the Hispanic Latino, which of course make up several races, it's not just one race, that has increased over 7% between 1990 and 2018.
So
we really do get to see a lot more color in our neighbors, which is really great. And,
it is, it's very different.
And they really are bringing a lot of vibrancy to some of our local communities and commercial corridors and things like that.
Well, it's not only people of color, but also, as you say, they didn't separate out, but we've also had a huge increase in immigrants from Africa.
Yes, yeah.
Which we had probably didn't even know where Somalia was in 1989.
Yeah, that's right, and I think we're a whole lot better off for knowing now where Somalia is and having them be our neighbors. In the 80s, that's when a lot of Asian immigrants arrived locally, both Minneapolis and St. Paul. I think St. Paul has higher numbers than we do. But it was in the early 90s when Somalis started arriving here. And of course, Minneapolis is a secondary destination. So East Africans and Somalis that arrive and land in, say, Los Angeles or some other towns, they will come to Minneapolis because of family or people that they know from Somalia.
And
so
that's really the same
part
thing.
of why people
Didn't that happen with Southeast Asians also, that they started out in California or the East Coast and then came here to the Midwest?
Yes.
So
yes.
Well, I guess that says good things about us.
Absolutely. And I think we've had different people running for office because of that experience.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Well, now, and that's a really interesting point. The legislature and the city council, more diverse now than they were in '89?
Absolutely. So 1989 was an election year in the city of Minneapolis, and so that was when Don Frazier was last running for mayor. And at that point, there were 2 African Americans on the city council, and there was 2 non-DFLers. Is that right? So 2 Republicans.
2 Republicans.
And so now it's significantly different. Let me, sorry, I have to like look at my notes here for that one, just to get the numbers right. So today on the city council of 13, there are 5 people of color.
5, wow.
2 transgender members. And back in 1989, there was the first openly gay council member, Brian Coyle. So he was on the
And
council
he was
at
a
that
guest, I
time.
remember, on the show back in the day, too.
Wow. Wow.
And so we
And
have,
then we have 2 immigrants on the city council as well.
really?
Yeah, so a lot of really great voices
really
representing a lot
changed.
of different life experiences than
Well,
we had.
And also, aren't our legislative delegation also is less white than it was
Yes,
then?
Yeah, very much so.
So that's a change, too.
So when I think about, we have represented by 2 African American senators and immigrant senator from Columbia.
Now, the question is, though, that you think about that and you wonder how the people have changed, but has the council really has always been very liberal? I mean, 2 Republicans back in the day,
Right.
so it hasn't
Right.
maybe changed politically so much as it has changed ethnically.
Yeah, that might be.
I don't know, but-
Currently, they're all Democrats except for one, who's not a Republican for sure, but a
Right.
Green Party member.
Right.
So it's kind of flipped a little bit.
Yeah, so that's
Yeah.
well. We talked a little bit about what's happening. I mean, how people are living now, and the kind of choices that they're making. I remember then it was you wanted to move out to the suburbs so you could have an acre and a big yard. And are people living smaller now than they were 30 years ago?
I believe that is the case. There's a lot of talk about people whose kids are out of the house and kind of wanting to downsize. So I think a lot of the people moving to downtown Minneapolis are in that kind of empty nester downsizing population. And I know that my neighborhood in South Minneapolis is full of young families.
Really?
And now we'll see if they move when the kids hit school age, but I don't think that that's been happening since the Great Recession.
So people are they wanting to live in the city? Or is it less expensive, or?
I think people want to live in the city. I'm not sure that it's less expensive. Some neighborhoods are, but when I was on the Met Council and had this conversation a lot with some of my colleagues from the more suburban locations, and they would talk about how you can get a home for a more affordable price in some suburbs. So that was kind of interesting to me. But
Yeah.
I think that that's the case. I mean, there's a lot of, can I talk about an experience in my neighborhood? I know this has been happening in Southwest Minneapolis a lot, where people will buy the smaller houses, tear them down, and put up big ones.
That's
and
something
it's now
that's new.
starting to happen in my more working class
Really?
neighborhood in the Longfellow area. So that's a surprise.
Well, now that is something that did not happen 30 years ago.
That was not happening
I
in
can't imagine
1989.
anybody
Yeah.
tearing down a house.
Yeah,
And now it's not that uncommon, is it?
right.
And-
I think that is true. In 1989, again, let's think, that's right when the neighborhood revitalization program was starting, which started because of the studies that showed the condition of housing. And so they wanted to reinvest more in housing. And so that was just starting at that 30 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow. And now the other thing that people are talking about now, and that they sort of talked about then, is the mother-in-law, the accessory units.
Right, the accessory dwelling units.
And is that a thing?
I don't know how many are going up. I know that a couple are going up, but it's a sign that the city and certainly the policymakers are open to higher density and different ways of living than just a single family home. I mean, they're recognizing that family units aren't mom, dad, and 2 kids. They can be that, but they can also be other things. And so they're opening the zoning to allow different kinds of ways of living.
That is something very different too, because as I recall, I mean, I'm thinking of the late 80s and then early 90s when people wanted the big yard and they wanted a lot of space. I mean, that was why people moved to the suburbs. It wasn't that they wanted smaller spaces and that they wanted, you know, to live small. They wanted an acre.
I think what some people want, I know in my neighborhood, and the thing that I like about living in the city is that you have access to things. So I am across the street from a park, right? And in Minneapolis, everybody is within 6 blocks of a park, right, by design. And so you don't necessarily need your own because you have that shared space. But it's also nice to be able to walk to a grocery store and walk to a hardware store. And I think people are valuing that as
So
well.
they're coming-
and not having to be beholden to a car.
Well, again, it's the sort of like people are commuting by bicycle. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the same thing that they're maybe walking more. I don't know if that's true or not.
I think so.
Well, now, one thing we talked about, the cost of housing seems to have really gone up a lot since we bought our first house 35 years ago.
Yeah.
What has that meant for people who aren't fully employed or who have big college debts?
I think that there's a big problem with the millennial generation being able to have the resources to be able to buy homes. And that might be part of why we're seeing more renters than homeowners. And just that the cost of housing is a real problem for anybody. And I think about the housing prices that are going up in my neighborhood with these tear downs. And, I was at National Night Out last night talking to people about, but do you believe how much that house went for? And really a concern about the next generation and who is going to be able to afford these homes. And so we're going to have to really figure that out.
Well, that's the question, because I've heard so many people talk about the fact that this generation of college graduates will not be living as well as their parents were.
Right.
Does that
Right.
seem to be borne out by what you have learned?
Absolutely. And the other thing that raises concerns about it are increasing the racial wealth gap then, right? I think we're learning a lot about how racially restrictive covenants and redlining really, and federal policies really denied people of color access to home ownership in that generation that allowed whites to get mortgages and move out to the suburbs and build wealth through their home. And it's just like the latest version of policy and market that is going to be keeping people of color from earning wealth in that way.
That is actually the most wealth that most people have is their house, isn't
Right.
it? And so if
Yes.
you don't have a house that increases, in the way these houses have increased in value over the 30 years, you have a lot more value now than if you had just put your money in a savings account, right?
Yeah.
So it's really, but
So there's some things that we really kind of have to fix, or else we're going to be burdened with these gaps in wealth into the next generation.
and go beyond that to think about the college graduate who will never pay off his or her loans.
Yeah.
Is that, that's something that's different. I think we all had college loans, but we all thought that we could pay them off at some point.
Right, and a college degree I remember a semester for me 35 years ago was about a credit now, right? It's about that much.
And it was it was a whole year. So
Yeah,
does
I don't
that
know how people
does
do
that
it.
change? Does that change people's feelings about success, or not success, but just happiness and well-being?
I bet it does.
I
what what's the experience that you see from the past?
Well, I
30 years too
guess
in
I
this
think
area.
that the BA bachelor's degree used to be your ticket to the good life, and now I hear that it's just sort
now
of like
it's not.
graduating from high school. You
Right.
have to have more than that.
Right.
And trade school, on the other hand, people who went to a trade were really looked down upon. Now people are saying the people who go to trade school are the smart ones.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
that's really changed in the 30 years. I think people's perception of being in the trades has changed just maybe in the last 5 or 10 years. So
Yeah, I think that's true.
and whereas now people are questioning whether they should go to college or not. We didn't question that. Our parents said, to get ahead, you have to get that degree. But now maybe they should say, well, you should become a plumber and you'll do really well. But it's a
Right.
whole different,
dental hygienist.
yeah, it's a different way of
something
looking
like
at
that.
it.
Yeah.
So what other kinds?
I do think this isn't necessarily related to just the city of Minneapolis, right? But the level of income inequality is really been exacerbated over the last 30 years.
So that really
Think
has.
about 1989. Yeah. So, yep.
So things are different. structurally different because, and do we know what's caused that? I mean, do your statistics say anything about what's caused it?
I am not sure. I'd like to do a little bit more investigating, actually, about how it is that our tax structure got to be the way that it is. And I believe a little bit of politics has something to do with it. And I think about national politics and how we got in this situation. And I think it's the same source that is creating the income inequality.
So it is a structural thing, but it's because of the way our tax system operates. Maybe that's gotten worse instead of better.
Yeah, I would think
that could
so.
be.
And less progressive.
Well, what other good things have you got there? You've got some other data there that looks interesting.
Let's see what other data I have. I think one thing that's kind of interesting, again, back to the home ownership gap between whites and people of color. We are in a worse situation now than we were in 1990 in terms of the gap between whites and people of color. But in 2008, that was the peak, both of home ownership rates for whites and people of color. So it didn't just go down, it went up and then down. Does that make sense? Or down and then up, I guess is
Right.
the way
Well,
it goes.
so it peaked in 2008. The difference was smallest in
Right.
2008, and
Right.
then but then that was
And now
2008 was the year of that we really hit the bottom, the Great
That's
Recession.
right, with a lot of foreclosures. So a lot of predatory lending practices that happened during that bubble in housing in 2006, 2007, and then crashed in 2008 really affected low income and communities of color a lot more than white communities, although it did affect white communities as well, as evidenced by the data. Nationally, so I'll just say, so in the Twin Cities, this is not just Minneapolis, but in the Twin Cities in 1990, the home ownership rate gaps between whites and people of color was 34%, right?
Which is significant.
Which is significant. And it's in part because whites have a higher rate than the national average
Here in Minnesota.
here in Minnesota, and then, or in the Twin Cities, and people of color have a lower rate. So nationally, the gap is 24.5%.
So
So it's a full 10% more
Here in Minnesota.
in the Twin Cities.
do
Isn't
we?
that remarkable?
Well, yeah, I think. Do we know why?
I don't know why. I think that, again, this is why, if you're familiar with the Mapping Prejudice Project and their efforts to map racially restrictive covenants, it kind of unveils this story of how hard it was for African American families to get into home ownership. And there's still some, practices of real estate.
Is it true? I mean, we've talked about African Americans, but would it be true for Hispanic people and Asian people as well, or is it just, or is our
Less so, but probably still the same. Yeah.
still some problems there?
Yeah.
Well, what other kinds of changes have we seen that now we've talked about? The fact that people have moved to different places, they're living downtown more. We talked about the difference in our elected officials. They're a lot more colorful now, literally and figuratively.
Yes,
I
yes,
think you could
absolutely.
say. Yeah. And now,
Well, I do wonder if we should talk a little bit about this, what makes a Midwesterner?
maybe that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have had a person of color representing Minneapolis area, the 5th District,
That's right.
since 2006, when Keith Ellison was first elected. But certainly with the election of Ilhan Omar in 2018, our representation in Congress has gotten a lot more attention, I think, nationally because of that. And I think what's really interesting is there was a recent tweet by one of the editors of the New York Times somehow suggesting that Ilhan or Minneapolis or the 5th District wasn't Midwestern.
Yes.
Somehow we're supposed to be different than that, and so I just think that it's important to say that Minneapolis has changed, but the Midwest is changing, right? I mean, we are Midwesterners, and we vote, and that's what we vote for. So
that is interesting, and it's true that it has changed because I was thinking about that because the Women's Press that I read recently profiled women throughout the state of Minnesota, And many of them were minority women living in small towns,
Yes.
not just living in the
Yes.
Twin Cities. So maybe it isn't just a Minneapolis-St. Paul thing. Maybe it is more of a statewide thing that people are, because of, again, maybe housing prices are more reasonable, or maybe there's a job there that
Yeah,
worked for
yeah.
them or whatever.
Yeah.
But, and of course, I think the other thing is when Keith Ellison was elected, I think he was the first Muslim to be elected from
Right.
Minnesota, but I don't know from the country as well.
In the
I'm
country,
not sure.
yeah.
Sworn in on the Quran, as I believe, which
Yes.
so really,
Like Thomas Jefferson's Quran, as
oh
I
really?
understand it. Yeah.
Could be.
Yeah.
So that's very interesting. So that what is a Midwesterner, and that's the question, and that would not have been a question 30 years ago.
Yeah, probably not.
No.
Probably not.
Well, and I think when you think about it, the people living in greater Minnesota pretty much, I think at the time there were still Hispanic people living, or Spanish-speaking people living in greater Minnesota, but that's about the size of it, perhaps. Or Southeast Asians, maybe?
Yeah, now there's a lot of Somalis and East Africans living in
Right, and-
some of the smaller towns. They went there for jobs, and now they are there for community. So,
So are you
Yeah.
optimistic about where we've come through the past 30 years and what's going to happen in the next?
oh, I'm anxious, as everybody is, to see what happens next. I'm excited about some investments we're making in transit. I think that is going to be a game changer. I like new people living and moving into the city, and I think we're all better off with more neighbors and more neighbors of color and being exposed to new things. So yes.
So you can look at it in any way you want, and some people are going to say, "Oh, this is a scary thing too," right?
Some people might.
That is always that. Well, I know
Right.
we're coming to the end, and I want to take a little time tonight to say to everybody who's been watching once in a while, we the people, thanks for being watchers and viewers, but I really want to say thanks to the crew. I have had a great crew for these many years. Scott Lohman has been with me since before he had a child who's now in his 20s. Tim Hopkins comes by bus every single month and hasn't missed a month, and has been here for probably about 10 years, I think. And the newbie is Paul Donnelly, who's our manager here on the set. And he is a new guy because he's only been here for a few years. But they all have been great, have made me look great, and I really appreciate what they've done. And I also appreciate the help we've gotten from Val Lockhart here at MTN. They've all been wonderful, and so have you, our viewers. So thanks again. This is Joan Higginbotham signing off for We the People. Good night.
Thank you so much.